Welcome, everyone. That was an abrupt ending to the music. I was trying to fade it out nicely, but I forgot that when I stopped sharing the image, the music would stop too. So sorry about that. But thank you all so much for joining us for this month's Changing the Odds Thought Leader interview with Karen Pittman. We are thrilled to have all of you here, and particularly thrilled to have David Adams joining us to talk with Karen. David was named the CEO of Urban Assembly in March and has had a long tenure with Urban Assembly, during which time he led the creation of their Resilient Scholars Program and the expansion of their organization's model. As always, this Changing the Odds Thought Leader interview is an unscripted conversation where Karen Pittman digs in with folks from across the allied youth fields to learn more about the great work that they are doing. So with that, I will hand it off to Karen to take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome, David. And welcome to those of you who have joined us. The primary reason that we're doing these is to really get these incredible thought leaders on record, so that we can unabashedly steal clips from them to put together as we really begin to tell the story of what it's going to take to change the odds for young people. We want to do that in as many leaders' words as possible. But these interviews have been so rich that we decided a couple months ago that we might as well do them with you if you want to join. So as Catherine said, they'll be archived and we will use them to really sort of pull out themes. But we also wanted to see what questions you all had. So thanks for being our live audience, and welcome, David. I want to dig into all the things that Catherine just said and understand where you're taking the Urban Assembly, learn more about you and how you got to the Urban Assembly, because I know some about you and your rich background and how you did this. But let's just start by giving people some basic information about what the Urban Assembly is. I know enough about it to be incredibly excited about what you've been doing and where it's going, but I want to make sure folks have the basics before we dig in.
Well, I appreciate the question, Karen, and I really appreciate you having me here today. I've been a great fan of your work, of your thinking for so long, so the opportunity to be here in conversation really makes my day. So thank you for that. The Urban Assembly is a collection of 23 public schools in New York City, and our mission is to enhance the economic and social mobility of young people by improving public education. So that means we take the 23 schools that we have within New York City. We work with schools across the country and think about how do we innovate within public education systems in ways that result in the economic and social mobility of our young people. So we think about this idea of innovating within public education, right? Innovating within education. And that means that we are focusing on the social emotional development of young people. It means we're focusing on thinking about how to integrate social emotional concepts into the academic approaches to teaching and learning. It means that we're thinking about college, career, and community readiness and what that means in the context of social emotional development. And it means that we're doing it in our district schools, right? Working with schools, with unions, with our principals, with all the regulations that come with that to innovate and then scale the innovation across the country. So very excited to be here. Very excited to be here on behalf of the Urban Assembly. I'm very excited to be in conversation with the legendary Karen Pittman.
I'm just old. I'm not legendary, but I appreciate the compliment. Yes, definitely share questions as they come in. So that overview is great. And when people go to the website, and which I did just to make sure I had all my facts straight, they're going to see some pretty impressive things. In addition to really stepping in to say, we'll take 23 regular schools, and these are middle and high schools, right? So we're going into secondary. We're not in elementary. We're going into secondary schools. And saying, how do we get in here and innovate from the inside out? And I just love that concept of innovating from the inside out, bringing people in with fresh ideas and commitments, but just digging into the mix of the realities of schools and then moving it along and not doing it as a demonstration project. So you really have been accountable for this. And so talk some about the success. How long have you been doing this? And as I remember from a chart from the website, you've really been seeing steady success in how well your students are doing. What's been the impact of this?
Well, let's start off with some of the things that I'm most proud of at the Urban Assembly, because I think this really goes to what it means to really think about what quality and school quality looks like. So just like other urban areas in our city, incoming proficiencies are not at grade level at the Urban Assembly. In fact, the incoming proficiency on average at the Urban Assembly is 21% in ELA and 16% in math. But that's not what we're going to talk about. It's the outgoing proficiencies that make me proud. Our outgoing proficiency in ELA is 84%. That means 84% of our students are on college and career ready, or college ready in particular, when they leave our schools. That's a 21% incoming proficiency and 84% outgoing proficiency. In math, 16% incoming proficiency, 66% outgoing proficiency, and our overall graduation rate is 86%. So when we talk about what I'm proud of the growth. I'm proud of the investment in young people. I'm proud of the teaching and learning. I'm proud of our schools who really make sure that every young person who wants to be a part of something has an opportunity to come to an urban assembly school and be invested in, to be nurtured, and to graduate ready to give their talents to our society.
Now, did you get to cherry pick these schools to decide which 23 schools you were going to work in? How did they get selected?
So it's a good question, right? This is a larger conversation, but back when the comprehensive high schools and Johns Hopkins had done work around dropout factories and what it means to graduate only 1 out of every 2 students. So in 1997, when the urban assembly was started, the graduation rate in New York City was around 48%. Right. And in response to that work, many initiatives were started, and some of them were breaking down these comprehensive high schools into small schools. And so the city had asked us to begin and start these schools and do that with a notion that, first of all students were welcome. So in New York City, we have this interesting system where some students are more welcome than others, right? There's this notion of screens in which schools feel like our instruction is good for some students and not other students, right? They say that this school is good for a certain kind of person, and that's not the urban assembly ethos. From the beginning, we said that all of our schools would be available to all of our students because we're going to invest not in screening students, but in sustaining and supporting them. So those comprehensive high schools broke down. The urban assembly was approached, and as well as some other organizations, to re-envision what it meant to be educated in New York City. And so we did this in a number of ways. One, we focused on career themes, what it means to connect your education to a career and certification. We organized CTE programs. We actually are the largest collection of CTE schools in New York City. We invested in the social-emotional development of our schools through things like advisory, through things like social-emotional skill development for staff and students. And then lastly, we really just thought about how do we get better. One of the things that I'm so proud of is over the last 4 years, we've invested in our algebra work. We saw that algebra was a really big barrier for our students to be successful. 4 years ago, 42% of our students were passing algebra the first time. Last year when we had our data, 92% of our students were passing algebra the first time. And that's not because we stopped picking students who were challenging in math, right? That's because we got better at the teaching and learning processes that help our students make meaning out of that mathematical work. So across the board, we really care about what it means to grow our students, to nurture our students' potential, and then to scale that nurturance, that growth across the entire city, so that what we learn is not just for our kids, it's for all kids.
So I love the algebra story, and Bob Moses would be proud of you for all that good work. 2 things, and I didn't say starting out, but I actually knew of David, but got to know David because we both served on the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, and had lots of great conversations on and offline.
Not on record, though. This is our first on record.
This is our first on record conversation. You're right. But one of the things that because you and I have talked about it, as the Seed Commission's work was ending, there were 2 themes that were just really surfacing that we hoped would get pushed further. And frankly, those 2 themes are really why the forum started the readiness projects and why we're having this series of conversations. One theme was really connection to community, and in particular, connection to leveraging those community organizations and community partners. I mean, if we're really going to say the science of learning and development tells us learning happens everywhere, informal and flexible and free choice experiences, and it really is about all adults, then we need to really understand what those partnerships look like and how schools become less of an island and really sort of embrace this ecosystem approach. And then the second theme, which you just mentioned, was equity, and how we really don't in any way assume that because we pay more attention to social emotional learning, we're automatically creating more equitable environments, but we take that on head on. I know you've tackled both of those things with the Urban Assembly. So talk a little bit about them. First, about who and how you partner with community organizations and why that's essential the sort of the secret sauce that contributes to your student success, and then we'll dig into the equity question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And from the very beginning, our founder, Richard Kahn, had really been invested in this notion of private-public partnerships. And the public education space, as it's developed, has not always taken advantage of the entire community and what the entire community can offer to our young people. Some of that has to do with the siloing of education. Our educators are developed through schools of education. They tend to come out of college, right? They went to the K-12 system, they went to college for education, and they went into teaching, right? And so that system doesn't necessarily always expose people to the wider community and the larger kind of context of what it means to be educated in that space, right? It's a very specific kind of pathway. And more importantly, we have what we call partnership coordinators in New York City, in the Urban Assembly. And those partnership coordinators are designed to really partner with the community, partner with these institutions who have an investment in what it means to educate public students in our city. Right, so it's a two-way street. On the one hand, young people start to think about their education not just in abstract spaces, but in an idea that this is going towards something. I can do something with this education. It's not just about what I know, but what I can do with that. And that's exposed when you have things like career pathways, when you have CTE programs, when you have folks who are working on projects that are relevant to who they are and what they care about. But on the other hand, you have folks who are in the city who want to invest in our schools, but don't necessarily know how, right? So this partnership system that we've developed at the Urban Assembly, it's about making sure that education is a two-way street. We're being responsive to what our industry is saying in terms of what it means to be career ready, what it means to be college ready. We're being responsive to what our community is saying in terms of what they want out of an education system. And we're being responsive to our young people by helping them understand that the things that they're learning are not just about solving equations and solving problems with equal signs next to them, but solving the kinds of problems that move our society forward, solving our problems of life, solving the problems of people, solving the kinds of problems that take us from where we are today to where we need to be.
So give us a concrete example. Pick one of your schools and tell us who are those partners? I mean, what does that look like?
Sure. So let's talk about the Urban Assembly School for Law and Justice. It's in downtown Brooklyn. And this is a school that's on the Adams Street campus. And that school it's focused on law and justice. And it's had a long-term partnership with a law firm. And that law firm has work-based learning opportunities for students in that school, right? Where they're able to go shadow lawyers come in, talk about their careers. Students pitch and have conversations in terms of mock trials in front of lawyers who give them feedback. And this kind of reality-based or relevance-based education helps our young people recognize that this is not just about that test, right? This is not just about that A, B, C, or D. This is about developing your skills in ways that unleash your potential for society. So that's just one example of the ways that we do this work. We have the Harbor School in Governor's Island, and that's a partnership between Governor's Island and New York City Department of Education and the Urban Assembly, where students are pursuing 7 and 8 career technical pathways or learning how to dive. They have the Billion Oyster Project. They're learning marine biology. They're out on boats, which is recently approved for pool to help them to do those things better. And just a continual notion of the skills that your young people are developing, not just for the sake of 1, 2, 3, 4 on a bubble, right? But like, what does this mean in the real world? How do my skills contribute to community? Who are we in the context of what we're trying to accomplish in the world, not just what we're trying to accomplish in the classroom?
Those are great examples. And does all this happen between 9 and 3? What have you expanded the time? Or is this moving into summer, or is it moving into the after school hours? How do you think of how do your young people move around in all of that learning time?
Well, let me tell you, Karen, here's the thing that I'm really excited about, right? And we've had so many challenges because of this pandemic. We've had challenges in terms of mental health. We've had challenges in social emotional development. But one of the things that I'm so excited about is this notion of seat time, right? How do we understand what it is to be educated and how students are learning? And what we've seen in the seat time is that we can be a little bit more flexible on what these learning experiences look like. I mean, we care so much about these work-based learning opportunities, but we haven't had the systems and policies that allow our students to go out and do these things during the school time. So to your point, these are after-school activities. These are before-school activities. They're not seen as part and parcel of what it means to be educated. We kind of have to work around the system, as opposed to saying, hey, going and doing those things is part of being educated. You probably have learned more in trying to balance your time in the last year, or young people, than they would have learned in 4 years of college or 4 years of high school. So one of the things I'm most excited about when I look at this opportunity from the pandemic to rethink this education policy, to rethink the education system, is to look at these seat time requirements and say, if kids are out there learning and working, then they are learning and working. It's not separate. They're doing the same things, but let's stop kind of having to play games to get them there, right? Let's make this part and parcel of what it means to be educated and graduated in our school systems.
It's such an important concept, and I know you've heard me say it, and we've been saying it for a year, that this disruption really has created the opportunity. Everybody had to very quickly think differently and act differently because we saw things differently. When the school shut down, a whole bunch of dirty laundry got exposed that we had to really see and deal with. And we'll get to that in a second when we talk about sort of equity and racial reckoning and what we do in that space. But you're right that it gave us an opportunity to change things, to say, if we can move things now, why can't we do this more permanently? Why are we hanging on to these old ideas that don't work? And some of that is language. So when you talk about that idea that learning really can and should be happening in the community for secondary students, that they should be having these different kinds of experiences, not just sitting in a classroom seat. What do you call that? Do you call it after school and summer? Do you call it out of school? Do you call it expanded learning? What's the language that you use to broaden this frame for where and when and how and with whom learning is happening?
It's inadequate at the moment. I don't have the language to represent the richness of what you just described, right? The language you use now is work-based learning, but even that, service learning, work-based learning, doesn't really describe this notion of what our young people can contribute to our society and to our communities, right? Even this idea of work-based or service learning as being part of the development so they can graduate and do these things doesn't really reflect that our young people can contribute so much of themselves to our society and our community. And when you're watching young people develop the skills of younger folks in terms of mentoring, when you're watching how they can support our communities, help us maintain community, I don't know that I have the language to talk about the broad space that our young people can be contributing. And we're not tapping into that potential at the moment, right? We are treating our young people as these things that are just not ready yet to contribute to society. And the better we do at getting our young people invested in our societies, invested in our communities, the more relevant the kinds of education that they experience in that classroom space will be. I'll tell you, when I was 17, I joined the military, joined the Army. And I was also 17 when I was a junior counselor for YMCA camp in Camp Spears. And I never forget the amount of responsibility I had. I had these little kids I was their counselor. And then I went back to school and I had to, raise my hand to go to the bathroom. And I was like, those kids, I was taking them through the woods. I went through basic training, but I had to ask to go to the bathroom. And so we're seeing that now. I see my kids in remote learning, even in the context of going back, they get breaks, they come back, they're accessing Google for information. They can do these things if we expand the notion of what we're trying to accomplish in our education system.
Yeah, those are great examples. And I've heard that. I think I've heard you say that. I mean, the amount of responsibility young people were given, appropriate responsibility for managing their own learning.
Right.
We're not going to squeeze that back into a box, or we're not going to do it without having a lot of resistance to those ideas. I think we're going to continue to struggle and think about the language and the terminology. And I see one of the comments on that. Learning Heroes, and you remember Learning Heroes did the first study for the Seed Commission about what language do parents use? Is it SEL? Is it SEED? Is it this? Is it that? And what came back was they just call them life skills, and they lump all this stuff together. When you say, what are the skills and competencies you want your young people to have? they mix reading and math and an understanding of history and culture in with, problem solving and, empathy and teamwork and, time management. All of those are things that they see mixed together.
Yeah.
Learning Heroes just completed another study, in part because of our urging, that in that they only asked about what do you want teachers to do? And we said, well, if there are other people in the community who are supporting young people's learning, shouldn't we ask parents how they think about those learning experiences? So when they were asked what language they use there, they came back to the very basic term that I had when I was growing up of extracurricular. It's like it, and you take that word and think about it, and it's like, okay, the curricular is the formal content that we want you to really get this and build these very specific reading skills, math skills, STEM skills, etc. But then you have to go out and apply them. And so extra doesn't have to mean, extra really means in addition to. It doesn't mean like nice but not necessary. So I think we need to come back and really play with the language of what we talk about in this space. I mean, so I'm glad that you're struggling with it, and we're going to struggle with it together.
So what you said resonated with me, and I'm thinking back to Neil Postman. He wrote this book, The End of Education, and he said that words don't just give us the ability to describe the world around us; they tell us what's important to describe, right? Using language not only helps us to describe, but it also shows like what are the things worthy of description. So when you talk about the language that we use, an extra versus, curricular, all these things have an impact on how we understand the purpose of schools, the purpose of our communities, and what it is that we expect our young people to be able to do and know and be as a result of our investment in who they are.
Good. So we've got you on record to be a part of the looking at terminology. We've got a couple people in the chat. There's like it's wider learning. We've got people talking about, we have lifelong learning. Should we have life-wide learning? I mean, and somebody talked about wider learning. We really do need to embrace. Yeah, it's an important thing to do. I mean, how we talk about these things, learning loss. I would love for us to erase the concept of learning loss. Young people lost learning time. They might have gotten rusty in some skills, but they didn't lose their learning ability. In fact, they were challenged to bring all of their ability as learners into making meaning out of these unprecedented situations. So to basically say that they lost learning is pretty much disrespectful of what they've gone through, as you said. And now they're going to come back into a box and raise their hand and go to the bathroom. So, we have that to deal with, but we have a lot to talk about. So let's go on to a conversation about equity. And I know that is the word that is on the top of everybody's chart this year for a bunch of reasons. But you all really did some very important and strong things to make a commitment to equity before George Floyd, before the pandemic, before this year. What did you do and why?
Well, I mean, for us, we got to understand that the mission of the Urban Assembly was always about ensuring that all young people had access to a high quality education. And we talked a little bit about this before, but a high quality education is about growth, right? It's about systems and structures to make sure that every student is seen, understood, and can be developed in terms of their potential. And that's not the same as saying achievement, right? That's not the same as saying, my math test score is in the 99th percentile, but my students were coming in at the 98th percentile. So, congratulations to myself. No, this is about taking all of your students from wherever their backgrounds are. I'm investing in every single one of them and making sure that they really can unleash their potential. So our grounding is about what it means to pursue equity in the context of education. And that means empowering young people to solve problems. That means ensuring that they have the thinking strategies that they need in order to understand themselves and the world. And that means bringing their whole selves to bear in the context of what it means to be educated. Karen, you know that we talk about this all the time. All learning is social and emotional. All learning has relevance to young people. And when we identify and tap into that relevance, young people identify and tap into us. Right. And so our commitment to equity has been around identifying and helping to ameliorate some of the challenges and to the achievement gaps that we've seen across our city. We look at our gender gap. That's something that is not the most popular thing to do, but the graduation rates of our African American males, even just versus our African American females, is a 10% difference. That matters, right? Not to mention between our Asian American males and our African American males. So that matters. Understanding our special education and E&L populations and what we need to do to support them, that matters. Understanding what it means to be supported in some of the numbers that we talked about before in math and algebra, and how that's being a gatekeeper. Those things matter, and they matter when we think about how we try to solve them. Right. I mean, I want to talk about briefly here. Right now, some of the incentives in our education system are about catering to a smaller and smaller percentage of our students, and then taking credit for their achievement. That's not going to improve the outcomes for our country. It's not going to improve the outcomes for our communities, right? Restricting access to education has never been an approach that helps move our communities forward. So I just say that the things that we care about are ensuring that all students have an opportunity to be seen, get high quality education, understanding why different students are achieving in different ways, what those patterns are, and investing back into those things. And making sure they're equipped to solve the problems that we need them to solve, right? And so many of those things are not going to have equal signs on the back of them. These are the challenges of society. These are the challenges of community. These are the challenges of having a multi-ethnic, multi-racial democracy that we need to pursue in order to be a more perfect union.
Good words. Let's broaden this out a little bit and talk about the work that you and other folks, school districts, turnaround for children, et cetera, have taken on to make this a citywide conversation. I know you were inspired by the report to the nation, a nation at hope, and have called it a city at hope. But who did you bring together? Why? And why was that an important thing to do? I mean, as you're really sort of figuring out how to not just have partners at the school level, but really have this broader city level partnership?
Oh, it's such a great question. So we worked together with Expanded, and coming off of this commission, it was about a year after the commission report had been released. We had this vision, right? And the vision that we had was one that organized and cohered the city's institutions around these concepts of social and emotional development, right? We're at this strange space in life, Karen, in which our society has vestigial kind of organs around the importance of social emotional development. They kind of know they care about it. And when you talk to parents, they're like, sure, absolutely. Like decision making, problem solving, character. These are things we care about. But the institutions that we used to invest in, that invested in our youth around these things, they have not done so well, right? We no longer have the quality and robustness of these spaces and places that wake themselves up in the morning thinking social emotional development, character development, these are things that organize who we are. And so some of this has been put out to our schools. Some of this has not been as robust as it used to be. And we had a vision to recreate that concept. We had a vision of recreating a notion of community that we all are contributing to our young people. This is the idea of a young person who comes onto a bus and may need some support in terms of interacting effectively. And an adult comes over and says, hey, this is how to do this. And that's not a critique. There's a quick story. I married my wife. We've been married 11 years now, and I grew up in the Episcopal Church. And in the Episcopal Church, particularly in the Caribbean community, a child is struggling. Every person wants to tell you how they can support, right? Like it's not a critique. It's just like, it looks like he's struggling. Let me go and take him or help correct his behavior in that context, right? Because every child is a member of that community, and every adult has a responsibility to help raise our children up in ways that they can participate in that community too. So we had this vision where the institutions, our parents, our juvenile justice reform, our nonprofits, our education system, our youth and development concepts, our equity organizations could come together and create a common language around what we want to do for our young people in New York City, what New York City youth should experience as the part and parcel of being in our community. And we work to do that with the report. We have an interim report, A City at Hope, and we came up with some principles that we think are going to help us move forward in that conversation. And those are the principles that we hope will recreate this idea. And it's a city of 10 million people, so it's ambitious, but recreate this idea that we're all invested in the development of our youth. And when we all see our youth and understand what we're trying to accomplish, our youth will experience a cohesive and coherent understanding of what it means to be in that community. And this is the New York City City at Hope.
So what are those principles that you all came up with? Because I like them. I mean, I've got them on my screen and I can read them, but I expect you have them memorized.
I do. I mean, well, so the important things here are what we came together, right? And one of the things we did, the first thing we did is we recognized that the education system often takes a monopoly on youth development in the context of where students are, right? So the first thing we did is we shifted the language from students to New York City youth, right? And that was a big deal, man. People were like, hey, I'm invited in that conversation. New York City youth is something I can contribute to, right? Churches, community organization. I touch young people's lives. I can contribute to that. So all adults, right, are responsible for not only investing in our kids, but modeling what it means to be social and emotionally competent for our young people. That's important, right? The adults that we put in front of our kids matter, not just because how well they can think, not because, they're like math whizzes, but because who they present to our kids has a reflection of how our kids understand who they're going to be. So that was one of these principles that we derived from this interim report. The first one, or the second one I should say, is that we're all responsible for our youth. We're all responsible for our youth. It's not just the education system. The education system gets the majority of funding, right? This is something that's been a constant space, but we're all responsible for our youth. And these are important things because what it does is it invites folks as partners to understand how we can invest in our young people. And I said this before, right? Social emotional development does not happen only in schools. It probably doesn't even happen primarily in schools, right? Camps, churches, civic organizations, basketball, right? I mean, these things, when you think about to kids, what helped me develop who I am? These are the things that they really resonate with. And the last thing, yeah.
No, go ahead.
The last thing is that we need to have a common principle. We need to have common language. We need to have a sense of who we are across these institutions so that we can communicate to each other around how we want to support our youth, what kind of community we want. And I want to use, again, Neil Postman's quote, and he says that public schools don't just serve a public, but they create the public, right? The kind of experience that our young people have are going to be the experiences that they bring to jury duty. They're going to be experiences that they bring to having conversations with their neighbors, pooping on their lawns with their dogs, right? They're going to be the experiences they have when they're trying to pass laws at Congress or even in a community. They're going to be the experiences when we are having different folks move into our community and we need to start to negotiate, well, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? And there really are only two choices here, Karen. We only have a choice in which this ends up in destructive outcomes or constructive outcomes. And if we're going to get to those constructive outcomes, we need to invest in our youth and not just through our education. Everybody needs to be at the table, and we need to all come to a consensus about what it means to develop the social emotional competencies of our young people.
I can only say amen to that, as you know. And the phrase that we've been using in the readiness projects for the past year and a half is really this idea about all adults in all settings, supporting all learners through all approaches across all of these systems that you've brought to the table. And you mentioned all of them, public and private systems that claim that they lead with learning, as well as systems that are focused on healthcare, systems that are juvenile justice. All of them have to be there. Again, because language is so important, and what you described is so clear and so much richer than what we hear when we hear people talk about social and emotional learning. And I think I have to go pick an evidence-based curriculum and bring it into my school. Yes, we need to have explicit instruction so that young people are building skills. But I think as I read the sort of the themes from, A City at Hope, you were really giving these both hands. It's like social emotional development is the responsibility of all of our institutions. So we're going to talk about New York City's youth, not just their students. We're not just going to use language that leads you to one organization. Social emotional development requires explicit teaching and relevant experiences outside of the classroom. So every place is important. And your last point, which was so clear, adult social emotional competence creates the models that young people need to see to facilitate their own development.
Mm-hmm.
You've just operationalized how every adult in the city can have responsibility. And then you really put together a partnership that says, and so what does that mean? And then you mentioned this idea of talking about what the adults need to do. And Catherine, you may want to put that slide up, pulling it out from the report. It was one of my favorite pages. Of course, that's too small to see, so zoom in on a couple of those, Catherine. Naming the kind of skills that we want young people to have, but then telling us what it is that adults need to do. If young people are going to have these skills, what do adults need to be doing for us to get them? And that kind of back and forth, that kind of explicit connection between what we need adults to do and what we want to see in young people is where I get excited and where I think this whole concept of we are all a part of an ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Young people and adults are swimming in the same water. And we need to pay attention to them. And this isn't just all about what it is that schools can do and which curriculum you pick. And even in your schools, the attention that you gave to adult social competence building and all of the adults in the schools was really important. So I think this is incredibly important. And one of the things that we'll do for the folks on the call is there's something in the water here about how organizations, school and community organizations and mayor's offices, et cetera, are coming to the table to say, how do we make our communities places of learning? And whether you're calling it City at Hope, we have our friends in Tulsa are talking about a summer of learning and becoming a city of learning. This language that we have to figure out what that means is really opening up opportunities for us to, again, think and talk differently about what it means to support learning. So talk a little bit more about, and I know you've only done the interim report and I know you're coming back to do more, but you've got a powerhouse of organizations at the table in New York City. Talk about what the next steps are for making sure that all adults really do understand the power that they have, and especially those adults who were in other institutions in which the undergirding of saying learning is social and emotional, which means if young people don't feel emotionally safe, and if they don't feel socially accepted, whatever you want them to do is not going to work well. But those organizations, as you said, are held accountable for other things.
Yeah.
The social and emotional part, even though we now understand it undergirds everything that helps the young person be in a place, is not what organizations are held accountable for. So as you and your city partners have come to the table, how are you going to tackle this all adults thing? How are you going to get adults ready to take this responsibility?
Well, it's a great question, Karen, and it's an ongoing conversation, right? But I can tell you that what we're really interested in is operationalizing some of those second parentheses, right? Adults around me. And just paying attention to what kind of adults that we have around our young people. Now, we've had conversations around hiring practices. We've had conversations around professional development. But we've really struggled to think about this idea that what the adult around you, who he or she is as important as what he or she knows and what he or she does, right? And so we're thinking about that now. And as we're going to move to our recommendation phase here, we've been looking and thinking a lot about two things. The first is hiring. What kind of adults can we support to be in front of our young people? And what are their responsibilities about being in front of our young people? I mean, this concept to me, Karen, it's so interesting that we think it's new or progressive, right? People like, David, you're a progressive educator. I don't think that I am. I think that these are like long time notions of what it means to support our communities and support our youth. I think we just forgot them, right? And so I'm happy to be in the progressive camp. I'm hanging out, having conversations with wonderful folks. But these are long-term concepts. Communities have always thought that the most important thing to invest in is integrating their young people back into their communities, and ensuring that their young people have a place in their communities. That's been the point of society for a very, very long time. And this is why our education system, as it's moved through time, had different kind of emphasis. And so what I see our work as is a return to the general purpose of education, not just the purpose of schools, but the purpose of education, right? And that means we are all involved in the social, emotional, academic development of our youth. And I just want to say it again, is the difference between schools and the purpose of schools and the purpose of education. I envision a future in which all of our adults say, yeah, I got something to contribute to this young man or this young woman. And when we give adults language, when we give them the opportunity, when we invite them to say, join us in this work, then they will come. And so we're going to be working on operationalizing that. We're going to help our adults who work with our young people understand what their responsibilities are, how to get there, right? And how to make this happen on a consistent basis. And we're so excited to look forward to continue to work with our partners to get to that clarity, so that our adults can use that clarity to help our young people be successful.
Good. Well, I know some of your partners in New York City, but I think I know all of your partners in New York City because of years of working there with you. But I'm going to put you back on the spot for
Okay.
urban assembly. So when we say all adults, and we can talk about all the adults in the city,
Yeah.
can you talk for a minute before we go to where you're going next to get beyond New York City with all this great work? Can you talk for a minute about all the adults in the building, or all the adults who are formally connected to your schools? How are you getting to all them? Is this just about teachers? What about the rest of the adults?
No. So this is a great question. And I actually had a conversation with one of our schools, at Urban Assembly Unison School. And our SEL instructional lead was talking about how she works with a basketball coach to talk about making sure students have access to social and emotional concepts while they're playing basketball: collaboration, decision making, responsibility, right? Making sure that every single person who touches our kids' lives have a sense of what it is that they're teaching them, right? It's about making the implicit explicit, right? So that means when we're working, and it's a little complicated because each of these groups have their different unions and they have their different chains of commands, right? But when we invite people together and we say, hey, can we talk to the school safety officers about the quality of communication that they have with our young people and how that impacts the quality of climate? We've gotten folks who have said, thank you. But we tried, and we've had folks who said, yes, yeah, I'm down with that. I want to have that conversation. And as we continue to do this work, we continue to try and problem solve around bringing folks together to see a vision of our young people as being supported by their interactions, by their support, by their development. And I think that the key on this, Karen, is saying you matter. Like, you matter. Lunch lady, you matter. Janitor, you matter. Bus driver, you matter, right? I need you. This is not about telling you what you're doing wrong. And that sometimes can be the thing. I am teacher. I am educated. I have my degree and my master's in child development. And I will tell you how to interact. And just say, hey, I would love to be in a conversation with you around how we can all work together to ensure that our students are the best version of themselves. So I think, we've worked on this. We've had some successes. We had some failures. We're going to continue to work on this. I think particularly in the context of our school safety agents, we really care about making sure that our students come to school and feel loved and feel supported and feel seen and feel respected. And that's something that we are working on. We got some work to do in that context. A number of our schools are schools where students go through metal detectors. We're working on making that experience be respectful, and letting our school safety agents know how to be respectful in that context and de-escalate. But it's about inviting people in. And I hope to continue to do that with the work that we're doing.
Yeah. It's so important. And again, as we go back through to make clips of these things, that clip is going to get a lot of mileage, because I just will go on record to say, I find it both baffling and frustrating in conversations with educators and education TA providers and researchers, how quickly the language just accordions back to teachers. Mm-hmm. Teachers. Clearly, teachers are incredibly important. But if we're going to say learning happens everywhere and all adults matter, we can at least look at all the adults who are connected to the school and all of the places, the cafeteria, the bathrooms, the playgrounds, the sport fields, the
paraprofessionals. I mean, like, here's a crazy thing. Yeah. We got paraprofessionals often working with the most sensitive students, the most challenging students, and rarely are we investing in their social and emotional development, right? So just to your point, we've got paraprofessionals usually from the community, usually a little bit younger, and yet those are the folks who are least invested in oftentimes in terms of how they're working with kids. So I just wanted to reiterate these groups and some of the complexity, but look, we're about solving problems, Karen, right? We don't sit around and complain about the world as it is. We envision a world as it could be.
Well, that's another thing to put on our language list, because we struggle with what to call them. Right now, we are calling them all adults, but at some point they really have these specific jobs, and those jobs on a pecking order get pushed down to, they don't matter. And so, as you said, they are modeling. They often have relationships with our young people. Yes. But if we say school is only where academic learning matters, the fact that I'm helping you understand your identity because I'm from the Caribbean and you're from the Caribbean, that's important. But nobody's acknowledging that. So those are the kind of things that, as we're really sort of seeing and hearing differently as we come out of this work, it's going to be incredibly important to keep these conversations going. I'm going to give you the last 10 minutes to say, how are you taking this across the country, David? Because the success rates that you've had, that growth from being in the 20s to being in the 80s in terms of your students' really, ability and readiness to go on to the next thing, and this approach, which really is an approach of coming in and meeting all of the adults where they are, showing them how important they are, and then really bringing in the training, the supports, the data, and the disaggregated data that you talked about to really make sure that we're just retooling this thing as fast as we can. That's great. You did it hands-on, in person in New York City. Now you're talking about taking it across the country. I'd be delighted if you're like standing up a national workforce, but what's your plan for making this go to other places?
Like, let's take this show on the road, right?
Let's take it on the road. How are you doing that?
I mean, so I think there's a couple of things that we care about. One is we really are thinking about, first of all, the language that we use. And you mentioned this, Karen, in terms of programs, curriculum. So we really talk about organizing schools around the principles of social, emotional, academic development. These are principles. These are ideas, right? And we've been really thinking about how do we operationalize these ideas into tools that allow folks to really inculcate them within themselves and then help other people see themselves in these concepts. So the first thing I want to say is the work we've been doing, particularly around the social emotional context, is not necessarily, hey, I can help you implement a social emotional learning program. Hey, if you want to get your assessment scores up, I'll tell you. But if you want to organize your school around these principles of social emotional academic development, if you want to look at your instructional formats and think about what ways can social emotional and academic supports integrate and develop each other. If you want to look at your extracurricular and put that right, extracurricular, and recognize that everything students do activate and develop social and emotional skills, let's be clear about those things. Let's talk about your basketball, your debate. Let's talk about your after school activities. Let's cohere, right, your partners for after school with your partners within school so students have a consensus around the environment that they're operating in and what we care about. Let's talk about your behavioral supports. I mean, I've been places where people like, David, I'm down with social and emotional learning, but I also have a zero tolerance policy in my behavior, right? I'm teaching social and emotional curriculum, absolutely. But, our approach to behavior is if you don't get it, you're suspended. Those things are not aligned to the principles of social emotional academic development. And so the work that we're doing is working with districts, working with schools, working with State Department of Education, and working with these tools that help people think and align their systems and structures to these principles, right? Because the key here is you got to have local problems or local solutions to local problems. I'm not going to tell you how to do this work. What I can tell you are these are the principles that I need you to consider while you're solving the problems for yourself. Right. And I remember I was working with a school one time and they said, David, we're doing a lot of this work for ourselves. I'm not really quite sure what you're bringing to the table. And I was like, oh, well, no, that's the point, right? You're doing the work for yourselves. What I'm here to do is help you think about it within these big principles and align that work to these concepts. So that's what that's looking like in the context of social emotional learning. In our academic work, these programs like Algebra Success, which have been really supportive to our students, these are infusing these principles of social emotional development, discourse strategies, making sure young folks feel part of that school and classroom community. Right? These are things that matter, and they matter not only in the social emotional realm, but they matter in our Algebra Success pass rates. Right? We threw out those numbers. It's about a 40% difference in 5 years after we really thought about investing in what's happening in the classroom. So those are the ideas that we have. We're looking at our career and college readiness. We're looking at understanding how we infuse those things, again, with these principles of social emotional development, with these principles of learning and development, with these ideas, so that when schools walk out, when districts walk out, when they think about what kind of young person that they're trying to put into world, they recognize this college, career, and community ready. And that means that the social emotional aspects of learning need to be elevated, they need to be developed, and they need to be supported in order for our young people to move us forward.
Well, we're ready to help you take this on the road faster, as much as you want. You have said so many things in that last sentence or that last couple of paragraphs that really do undergird the ideas that it's going to take to really get people to not think that this is just implementing a curriculum. Mm-hmm. This really is getting people to think differently about an approach. The tagline, or one of the taglines that the forum has had for a long time, that Rita Irby and I put together, is just, it's about moving ideas to impact. Yes. And you do that through a series of things. I mean, you start by really making sure the ideas are compelling. Mm-hmm. And clear and evidence-based, but they have to be ideas that people can get at. That's that right. Get them to think differently. And as we've said, as we're getting people to think differently, we often need to get them to talk differently. Our language, especially in education, as you said over and over again, is getting in the way. Mm-hmm. It so puts us into an automatic space in which we think learning, we think academic, we think the classroom, we think seat time. There's so many things that you're trying to disrupt that just sort of come along with one word. That we have to get people to take the time to actually figure out how they're going to talk differently and talk the same so they understand each other.
That's right.
Then we've got to see and hear differently. You talked a lot about disaggregating data.
Yeah.
You talked a lot about hearing from students. Yeah. I think it's going to be really important to hear from those other adults. One of the most empowering things we can do with those other adults is hear them talk about where they have had an impact or where they think they could have an impact. It is very empowering. One of the things that I find so interesting when we go out and talk to folks, anybody, is when you say, close your eyes and think about one of your most powerful learning experiences. Rarely is it actually in the classroom. It was someplace in which you had that ability to be with somebody that you know, who knows right. you, that you're sure they're there, not just because they're being paid, because they want to be there.
Right.
You're experiencing something that you're interested in, and you are learning something that immediately is helping you make meaning that you can carry away. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Whether that was I learned to change a tire, whatever it is, mm-hmm. You're making algebra meaningful in a way that really maybe when people ask me for a learning experience, I remember learning algebra. I remember my algebra teacher, but I'm very unusual that way. Most people are not going to go there. But that idea of getting people to see and hear differently and really hearing from these voices of mm-hmm. parents and young people and the frontline staff, not just teachers, and how they're interacting is there. And then, as you said, we have a lot of work to do to not just act differently, to make different decisions, mm-hmm. but also to react differently when we hear about other things that are going on in the community that we could be connecting to, and not make assumptions. So this whole idea of you leading with ideas and then helping people operationalize them.
That's right.
And what I'm hearing you say is a lot of that comes from people saying, we are doing it. And one of the things we often say is, we know you're doing it.
That's right.
But do you have the right lenses to see all the things that you're doing so you can leverage them? And that's what I think you're taking out into the world. And I'm so excited that we've had this time to talk together.
Likewise, I mean, I have nothing to contribute because that I think you said it better than I do, which is always a nice thing
We have it taped. You could you could steal it.
to be a relationship with. But yeah, I mean, we're really excited about the work. And Karen, you've always been somebody who's inspired me in terms of the way that you think about and the way that you've operationalized and actioned this work. And so I'm really excited to stay in community with you and stay in relationship with you and your work. And I'm excited to contribute to whatever I can in terms of the forward motion of our country.
That's right. Well, we are going to, as we say, build forward together. And with that, I'll give it back to Catherine to see whether she wants to tell us what comes next or put on nice music or whatever you'd like to do, Catherine.
That's a lot of power. I will tell you what is coming next. We hope that we will see many of you next week on May 19th and 20th at our Ready by 21 national meeting. And we will be following up with our next Changing the Odds Thought Leader conversation in June. Please join our mailing list or follow us on Twitter to get more information about that session. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, David. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.